This is episode 86. Today is November 23rd. I usually let the listeners know because I usually publish it a day or two after because I try to get them out quickly.
All right, as Janice said, welcome everyone. So for today's class, we're going to be focusing on art and activism. And I just wanted to go over today's learning outcomes. So today we're going to apply analytical and expressive skills towards influencing policy and policy change through activism. We're going to review and discuss examples of art for activism. We have a guest speaker here with us today, Claude Schryer, and I'd like to take some time at the end of today's class to review our final assignment. So I thought that I would start by sharing this image here. Unfortunately, this is a timely image given everything that's happening in British Columbia with the flooding. This is an art installation by two Finnish artists called Lines, the installation, which cuts across the walls of a number of surrounding buildings along the Scotland coastline. It aims to serve as a visual warning of the long-term effects of climate change on the environment. And the artists state that the installation explores the catastrophic impact of our relationship with nature and its long-term effects. The work provokes a dialogue on how the rising sea levels will affect coastal areas of inhabitants and land usage in the future. So seeing as we are talking about art and activism, today I wanted to demonstrate right off the top what art can do within the social and environmental landscape, which we'll spend all of today's class focusing on. So first, I wanted to, we're going to kick this off with somewhat of a non-traditional presentation. As I mentioned last week, Claude is joining us. And because he has a podcast with a format of interviewing very interesting people, I thought I'd turn the table and interview him, who also happens to be a very interesting person. So I welcome all of you after I ask my questions to Claude to unmute and ask your own questions. So I'm going to unshare now, and I'm going to just read over Claude's bio so you all get a sense of who he is. So Claude Schryer was born in 1959. In Ottawa. He is a Franco-Ontarian sound and media artist, arts administrator, facilitator, and cultural worker. From 1979 to 1999, he got a master's in composition at McGill University and was involved in interdisciplinary work in environmental art and acoustic ecology. From 2000 to 2020, so for 20 years, he was the manager of InterArts Office and then senior strategic advisor at the Canada Council for the Arts. Claude was also a grant officer for both Janice and I at one point in our careers. Claude was also, so he's currently a producer of the Conscient, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly, podcast, and founding member of the Coordination Circle SCALE, which stands for the Sectoral Climate Art Leadership for the Emergency. So welcome, Claude. As this class has been learning and thinking through Canadian art and cultural policy, Janice and I have been weaving in both equity and activism throughout the whole class up until this point. I've shared a bit on the difference between advocacy and activism as it pertains to the art sector, but this is our first class dedicated to activism. And also our first look at specifically what the arts can do for activism within the larger social arena. I'm also hoping that with this conversation and the class this might prompt the class some thinking and inspiration for your upcoming event, Arts Ahead, that you're all currently organizing, as it sounds like it's very much in line with the theme that you've all come up with around art uprising. So Claude, I wanted to first start with an audio clip for...
Can I just say something first?
For sure.
Just so that the group knows that I'm recording this on my end as an episode of the podcast. And if you don't want to be part of, just let me know after and I can cut you out. But I'm hoping that you're willing to do that. And thank you in advance. And I also want to say that I'm coming to you today from Vancouver, which is the unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. So it's important to start the day that way. Thank you.
Great. Excellent. So I am going to start with an audio clip from one of your podcasts, episode 40 with Alexis Fraz, I believe you pronouncing it. Yeah. But feel free, Claude, throughout this whole interview, if you also want to include some excerpts from your own podcasts, please feel free to do so.
There is a lot of awareness and there's a lot of interest in making change, and yet change still isn't really happening at least not at the pace or scale that we need. And so it feels to me increasingly like there's not a lack of awareness or a lack of concern or even a lack of willingness, but actually a lack of agency. And so I've been thinking a lot about what is the role of arts and culture and creative practice in helping people not just wake up to the need for change, but actually undergo the entire transformational process from that moment of waking up, which I think, you and I share a language around Buddhist practice. And there's that, idea that you can wake up in an instant, but integrating the awakeness into your daily life is actually a process. It's an ongoing thing.
Let's start off with that big question, Claude. What is art's role in activism when it comes to social good? Is it simply a matter of generating awareness, or does it have the capacity to give us agency?
Well, it's a good place to start because the article that you circulated to me a while ago, assessing the impact of artistic activism, which I recommend to everyone if you haven't read it, talks about a definition of activist art, which is more or less, art that is immediately addressing an issue. But of course, in the arts, there's a wide spectrum of practices and terminologies, and not everything fits into a box. So I try not to categorize too much, but I know that you're focusing on art practice that is engaged in the moment on an issue. So let's look at that. What do we mean by art? Right? There's already issues in as Canada goes through decolonization. What do we mean by art? Are we talking about the sort of Western elitist arts? Are we talking about popular art? So let's just have a really broad definition of art. And I think that art plays a really important role in activist issues, but it's far, far beyond awareness, right? That's been the traditional way. Let's raise people's awareness of an issue, and then they'll figure it out. What's happening now is that people are doing art in the streets, but they're also doing setting up organizations, doing cultural activities that aren't conventional art practices, but are very much interventions. So, in performance art, for instance, practice, if you think of the work of Rebecca Belmore, it's not, she doesn't label it as activist art, but I think of it as that way. When you go into performance with her, it is right in front of you, and the issue is so visible and so direct. So it's, for me, I wanted to, in fact, I will play a short excerpt of episode 84 because I recorded it here in Vancouver, and it's a really interesting example of what's happening in the field. So I'll just set it up for you. It's one of those Fridays for Future protests around the world. This one was in Vancouver. But there were some young people who did some hand painting with washable paint on one of the federal buildings. And just as the march was about to go up towards banking and doing its thing, the protest stopped. And the protesters did not want to leave these other protesters behind because they were about to be arrested by police because there was a public mischief type activity. So where's the art? Is protesting, putting your hands, red hand paint, a ceremony? Is it art? One way or another, it did not please the power structures of police. And what I did, and what I do in my art practice, is record soundscapes, because there's all kinds of different art practices, but mine is, I'm a sound artist. So I recorded it, and I just made it a witnessing of that moment. And I'll just play you a little bit. You can watch the whole thing if you're interested. It's about 20 minutes, but you'll get a quick idea here of what that moment was like. And for me, it's an interesting example of a type of activist art, or activist activity anyway.
It's washable paint! Washable paint! What the heck?
So that's a quick example of an event. Now, whether it's art, like I say, to be determined. I don't know if I answered your question, but I maybe I'll just start with that, and we can then go with questions, because there's so much to talk about and to unpack around this topic. I'm a believer in activist art, but I also have been noticing that some people think we're in a post-activist age, and that activism isn't enough. And that just expressing yourself or raising an issue in this climate emergency in which we are all, unfortunately, a part of, we need to move into another phase or another type of activist art. Though the history is fascinating, because art has made a difference, and we're going to get to the policy part a bit later, but art has made a difference in social movements, really big differences. But the challenge in front of us now is so massive, it's hard to imagine that just sort of conventional art activism is going to do the job. We have to really rethink everything that we're doing because of the situation that we're in.
Yeah, I think I would argue that we are in a post-activist place at the moment, but not a post-art activist or art. And we'll definitely, the class, we will be discussing that later. But yeah, I do think that the art in activism certainly serves a very relevant and current purpose. That's for sure. Mm-hmm. I wanted, in reference to that article that you mentioned, through the Center of Artistic Activism, which is a center that's based in New York City. And I shared with all of you, with the class, the website. There's a tagline on their website that says, "Imagination powers change, and change is power." In your experience, Claude, can art affect policy? And if so, is there an example you can think of?
Well, in community-engaged practices, because of the process of dialogue, we have seen many, many examples of change. Simply because people talk to each other, they come together around an art practice. So there's many examples. And I want to give the voice to one of the earliest podcast recordings I did with Beth Carruthers, because what Beth has done is point to the biggest issue, which is that it's really hard to measure the impact of an art practice on social policy or government policy. How do you connect the dots? Because when you get a grant or when you do an activity, the reporting usually doesn't ask that question. It asks, what was the impact on the public? How did you feel about it? What do you think changed? Did it affect public policy? Is a really interesting question. And so what Beth is saying is that we need to ask those questions future forward so that we have a better idea of what how the art's affected. So I'll just play very quickly that excerpt of Beth, and you'll hear it in her own voice. And she talks about a project that actually did change policy or did change a situation here in British Columbia. So I'll just play this quickly for you.
It's great when a project is long-term. I just recently used as a case study a 10-year project out of the West Coast, which was a collaboration with the Squamish Nation. It was called Utsam Witness, and Utsam is the Squamish name for witness, term for witness. And it was centered around aggressive clear-cut logging of an intact old-growth forest ecosystem in the Squamish territory, which is unceded territory. And in British Columbia, there's a Forestry Act, and there are specific rules for how one goes about doing forestry. So anyone, not anyone, but a forestry company purchases a tree farm license. So they designate an area as a tree farm license. And then they can go in and cut what they want. And they give the government a fee, which is per tree, which is called stumpage. So that's how the government makes money off of this logging. So in this case, the Squamish Nation were very concerned about logging in their territories. There was some sacred land in there, some places very important to the Squamish. So the outcome of this project, to cut to the chase, which was a 10-year socially engaged project with a bunch, too many activities in it, in workshops involved in it that were arts focused and arts based and engaged to go to detail. But I will say that the basis of it was really simple. You invite people to come up and camp for a weekend in the mountains in this area where the logging was taking place, which is a tremendously beautiful watershed that feeds into the water system of the city of Vancouver. So, and there they would experience Squamish tradition and ceremony and become part of this. And it was very profound. It moved people profoundly. And over the 10 years of the project, 5,000 to 10,000 people participated. And each one of those people was formally involved in a witness ceremony, so that in oral tradition, that is a ceremony in which you become officially a witness. In other words, if you're called upon in future to say what you experienced and saw and witnessed, then you should come forward and speak. So it was the calling forth of these witnesses that in the end stopped the forest company from logging in a very culturally sensitive area. They sort of challenged the Squamish Nation to say, well, who is this important to anyway, right? They said, well, it's important to us. And wait, it's important to all these other people. And here are their voices saying this. So at that point, that opened up a whole space to negotiate with the province that had never happened before.
Yeah. So do you want to comment on that a little bit, that example?
Yeah. It's an example of the power of witnessing. And if 5,000 and 10,000 people are involved over a long-term process in witnessing, that's a simple act that's very powerful, and that changed the course of government, of BC government policy. So that's an example of, and I wanted to have you listen to Beth directly. I have witnessed quite a few when I was at Canada Council situations where, in spite of not asking the question, artists would write back and say, you know what this piece did? It changed people's minds. And often it's because you're talking to people's hearts as opposed to their minds through an art practice, through a play, through an exhibition. And people are moved. Bureaucrats are people, right? And so they go to an exhibition or a show or a film, and they're emotionally transformed, or at least touched by the artwork. And then they go back and do their jobs and they say, we can't do this. Now that I know what I know, now that I felt what I felt. So I think the power of art is extremely, it's not so much underused as it is there, present. And it does affect public policy. And often it's a trickle, because it has a little bit of influence here and a little bit of influence there. But I think now, in the current circumstance, it could play a very important role as arts and cultural workers demand change and do it through their art practices in so many different ways. So that's my answer. I think Beth says it all in that example, and I certainly have seen it happen, and I'd like to see it happen more in a way where the art does what it does for its own sake, but also is very much connected to issues of the day. How can the arts address an issue like climate change? I'll talk a bit more about that later.
Yeah, so I want to reflect on some of this a little bit more and dive a little bit deeper, but through maybe the lens of a funder. You were a grant officer for quite some time, 20 years at the Canada Council for the Arts. And I'm sure there are many times, as you've kind of just referred, where arts organizations receive funding and you felt just this abundancy of thrill because you played a role in making sure that art was contributing to society in very interesting ways. Aside from just providing that financial support, what role can arts funders potentially play when it comes to art and activism?
Well, I'll tell you a bit of a story. When I started in InterArts in 1999, art and activism was not really considered an eligible art practice, or at least it was on the margins of, along with community-engaged arts and some other art practices that were more marginal. A lot of the cross-sectoral art practices, art and health and so on, they were on the, what is this art? Why are these people doing these kinds of things? And so one of the things that I did is try to bring in programs and initiatives to legitimize perfectly valid ways of working, in fact, very powerful ways of working. So you're asking about how does the council or the funder deal with it? A lot of it has to do with peer selection, having peers who have open mind and are able to assess the work, but also criteria that is open and responsive to I give you the example of community engaged arts because it's a really good one. At the beginning, what we called artist community collaboration, we had to create a special program for it because it wasn't seen as something that could be integrated, even though it was, because there's all kinds of community engaged practices in conventional art forms, but it's not labeled that way. And so there was this sense that we had to create a silo and another silo for this and another silo for that. And it worked to a certain extent, but then the art forms started mixing, right? And then we didn't know what was what. We call it interdisciplinary art, new artistic practice. So a funder needs to be responsive to the art practices that are happening in the field, to be able to assess that fairly for what it is and not have it twist itself out of shape in terms of its intentions. And I think over the years, the council and other arts councils around the world have gotten better at it. There are still things that are excluded, still things that have what we call unconscious bias. So you're not even aware that you're biased. You're just taking your knowledge and your history and applying it to the art forms. So that's why I really think that there's another era of arts funding coming. And the Canada Council, for example, its latest strategic plan talks a lot about social equity. It talks about social innovation. These are terms that were not so common 20, 25 years ago. So we're into a different language now and a different era of funding, which I think is positive for those who, whether you call it activist or not, who are addressing issues, especially if they're cross-sectoral, if they are collaborating, say, with the health sector or other sectors. Those practices are much more, I think, needed, and we will be able to fund them and to support them future forward, and that's a good thing for the arts. And the traditional art forms will also continue; they're also very important. But these expanding art forms, we planted seeds years ago in InterArts, and it's starting to unfold now, I think, nicely.
Yeah, it's very true. I do think that there is a shift happening and happening soon within the Canada Council for the Arts. So it'd be interesting as they roll out that strategic plan going forward. I'm wondering if you can share your current interests in art activism. Scale, I mentioned in your bio, but there may be others. What possibilities do you see within the arts or general public that encourage you to keep continuing to do this work? As we all know, it's exhausting, it's long-term, and it's a long-term commitment. So what are your current interests in art activism? What are you currently working on?
Well, I retired from the council in September of 2020, so in the middle of COVID. And so I felt the need to leave the institution and to do my own work for the rest of my life. And so I've been doing that. You and I and others created Scale, and that's basically a national coalition of like-minded artists and cultural workers who want to address the climate emergency in a number of ways. And that there was a gap there in Canada, because in England you have Julie's Bicycle, in Scotland you have Creative Carbon Scotland, but we didn't really have something like that. So we've created it, and anyone's interested, we have a very simple website, but in a few weeks there'll be a lot more information available. People can become involved in work groups and assemblies and all those kinds of things. So that's taking up a lot of my time because it's so urgent that we mobilize the arts and cultural sector. And I think one of the interesting things about Scale is that it started with activists, environmental activists, and people like Anjali Appadurai and Anthony Garofalo-Sauger, both of whom are on my podcast, and Seth Klein, who leads a climate emergency unit. So it was from the beginning a cross-sectoral approach. And I think that's where the arts need to be. They need to be at the table talking about the issues of the day, and they need to be collaborating with other sectors, be it environmentalists or scientists or whatever. This idea of silos, we each do our own thing, that's not helpful at this point. Your question was, what am I doing? I'm doing the podcast as well. This is episode 86, by the way. Today is November 23rd. I usually let the listeners know because I usually publish it a day or two after, because I try to get them out quickly. I do it as a public service and also as a way to educate and re-educate myself, because quite frankly, as a white settler in his early 60s, I've got a lot of re-education to do. And one of the best ways to do that is to listen. So the theme of this season is radical listening. So I'm trying to be radical in I don't know, in a real way, I look at the real issues. So I'm interested in the truth. I'm interested in what we can do to both mitigate the climate emergency and adapt to it. And then there's another level, which is revisioning the world. And maybe that's the one that's most interesting, because unfortunately, it's going to be rough for the foreseeable future on Earth. But life will go on with or without humans. I think humans have a place in it. But then we have to figure out how we're going to live with much, much less resources and all the damage that's been done, and a positive view of that. So rethinking, reauthoring the world. David Maggs wrote a really interesting paper about that. There was a paper recently by a writer, a Nigerian writer, Ben Okri. I'll put the link in. Who talked about artists must confront the climate crisis. We must write as if these are our last days. That's where I'm at. So I'm in emergency mode. I am an artist, therefore I'm working with my community, my peers. I know that young people are concerned. There's eco anxiety that either is being addressed or not. But I do think we have a very powerful sector. We have a lot to offer, not just nationally, but internationally. I think Canada, the world needs more Canada in that way, not as a extractive capitalist state, but as a sensitive, diverse country that has so many different voices that can address the complex issues of the climate emergency. So that's what I'm up to: scale, podcasts, lectures like this, writing, thinking. I'm a Zen practitioner. I started doing Qigong recently, which is really good for my liver. So, you try to stay alive and you try to be relevant and to work with others. Work, collaborate, listen, work, collaborate, stop, rest, activate, do art, support art, listen, stop, that kind of cycle of doing the best you can to address the real issues in front of us. So yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Excellent. Just a little bit,
It's fun.
Are there any questions from the class for Claude? Just feel free to unmute and go for it.
Hi everyone. For non-artists like me, what is it that I need to do now to be an activist and to support all those advocacies like climate change, Black Lives Matter, immigration, and all those topics? So how can I help? How can I be an activist?
That's a good question. There are organizations. I was going to talk about the Only Animal here in British Columbia that Kendra Fanconi leads. I'm actually going to visit her tomorrow and talk and do an interview with her, another interview, because I've done one already. So one thing you can do is support organizations that are doing work financially as a volunteer. Get involved with those who are already doing work. She has a project called the Artist Brigade. So it's really interesting to see how that's unfolding. But I think you personally, I think I did an interview with Judith Marcuse, who talked very eloquently about the role that creativity plays, our own creativities.
And I feel really at the base of myself that creating anything, art, sofas, whatever it is, allows us to give of ourselves to something that may not be lasting, but in the moment, that act of creation can engender hope, can engender a sense of autonomy, a sense of possibility. And we can't despair right now. We're at a tipping point, as everyone is saying. And the question for me is, how do we find the energy, alone and collectively, to keep moving in this urgency that we're all feeling without drowning in despair? And I think art has an essential role to play in that agenda.
So everything that we do, whether it's sewing or drawing or singing, has meaning. So I think being expressive, doing it with others, getting involved with organizations who are doing good work is like a first step. And then you use your skills, whatever you're good at, you can offer them. Like Scale, or people are coming to us every day now to Scale and saying, how can I help? And I'm a videographer, or I'm a social media person. And so there's that volunteer angle. There's the using your own skill set to apply things that have been shared. And I think it's also a question of participating, of being involved as much as you can in things that feel right to you, and some people don't want to go in the public and protest. Well, write letters or give money or advocate for democracy or whatever it is you want to do. All of these different activities combine to create a mass of activity that will change the world. But I think we have to be true to ourselves and do what our heart speaks. And there's so many opportunities in the arts and cultural sector for participation.
Vanessa?
In your opinion, how important is the role of education when it comes to activism?
Well, it's a good question. In Scale, we have a whole work group on education, training, and tools. There is so in schools, young people are taught about art a little bit, but not so much about the history of art activism. That would be an interesting thing to add on to, so that people know that we're not starting from scratch here. There's as long as there have been humans, there have been activist art practices of one kind or another. So that raising the knowledge level of what has happened and what is currently happening is a big part of it. So Scale is trying to do that through its education work group and do webinars. And but I think beyond that, I think there's tools that are missing. Like one of the barriers in artists becoming more active in the climate emergency is that they don't have easily accessible tools. So for instance, in Montreal, they're developing a creative green tool now to measure the carbon footprint of arts organizations. We didn't have that before. That will make a difference when you actually can see that when you take a plane to Tokyo for 2 days, how big the impact is. It's really big compared to, not using paper for your program. So if you actually start measuring and getting an idea of scale of what impact, what's your own carbon footprint, where do you want to go? They're all education processes. Some of them are self-education. Some of them are just getting institutions to provide knowledge, information, and opportunities to learn and to come out of. I talked earlier about the eco-anxiety issue. It's a real issue for a lot of people. They're feeling powerless, or they're feeling like there's nothing they can do. Well, we have to go beyond that, and we have to recognize that eco-anxiety process is one that can be overcome to a certain extent through discussion, through education, and that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but education is huge.
Micah.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Hi.
My question is more towards, I think, in the arts industry, and on top of that, in terms of activism, I feel like there's also a really high risk for burnout and for sort of a lack of reward in terms of the work that you do. I think a lot of the time it falls on deaf ears. And so I was wondering, in your experience, what support systems have been put in place to support arts activists in their journey? And if it's okay if there's a gap in that, if there isn't a support system that that's okay. But I would just like to know your opinion.
Yeah, well, there are a number of them. Again, I'll refer you to, I think it's episode 83 or 84, I forget right now, with Tracy Friesen here in Vancouver, who set up a few years ago a fund to amplify the impact of socially engaged films.
And what's starting to interest me is stories of resilience for a post-carbon world. What are we going to need for our emotional well-being? What are we going to need? It's going to be a different world. Not long from now, if we do this, and we have to do this. This transition has to happen. And there's going to be a sense of loss and sacrifice and challenge, not just with what's happening externally from a climate point of view, but in how we're going to have to, make changes to our lives and reorient our energies in terms of our advocacy. And so I feel like there's an opportunity for artists. I'm more connected to the film and television sector and the documentary community, but throughout the system, to be able to provide realistic and yet reassuring narratives about what the upside of all this might be.
So this is just an example, but one of the things that happens when you create a film, she was at the NFB for a long time, is that if there isn't an impact campaign, the great film with a great story sits on the shelf, or very few people see it. So that's one of the things that's opening now, is that not only are artists being funded to create work, they're being funded for it to be impactful in society in ways that are like a real campaign, where you have specialized workers who are promoting the film and connecting and networking. So I think that's one of the things that is missing right now, is to amplify the good work that's already happening, and to recognize the type of work that is important for us now. So the work by Indigenous communities, for instance, there's the Indigenous Climate Network, which is not specifically about art. It does fantastic work on climate action and Indigenous knowledge being applied in the climate emergency. Go listen to them, and then artists can work with them. And so that's an example that we're not necessarily in a world where art is so siloed that it's just talking to itself, where art is opening up to the world and to all these possibilities. And I think we need to accompany the artists, recognize those who are in the front line, give them support. Things like what Tracy Friesen is doing in her organizations around amplifying impact. That's also another possibility. So I think this is very important. We need to break isolation. So one of the things we learned in Scale is that a lot of artists feel alone. There's a group in Alberta, Traction. I'll put the link in the episode notes, doing really good work. They just put a call out for curators. They got funding from the Canada Council to do a gathering and research. This is very exciting. But when we first talked to them, we said, well, we didn't know there were others like us across the country, right? And there are many, many. In Montreal, there was just a major gathering by Culture Montréal, and 200 people showed up talking about art in the climate emergency. So this is what we need, is for people to have solidarity with each other, share knowledge, change funding practices, change the social system, so that we understand that artists need to play a much larger role, and that they are doing it, and they will need to do much more of it, and you're not alone. So that's my first answer to your good question.
Thank you.
So there's a really good question from Farah in the chat, which I think is really interesting, and I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts on this are, Claude. How do you balance the opinions and viewpoints of other activists? What do you do with conflicting ideas within community? What do you do in the case of controversy? I was actually listening to another podcast quite some time ago, and on the Women's March, and there was a divide, because there were two different groups who had two different viewpoints on how things should go. And so there were actually two different marches. So how do you, in your opinion, manage that?
Well, art is generally open to many possibilities, although there are points of view. But usually what art does is open your mind to considering different points of view. But there are conflicting views. There will be, say, a right point of view or a left point of view, or communities advocating for their situation. I think it's all about dialogue. Personally, I've seen conflicts be resolved by people sitting down, whether they're doing art or not, but talking to each other and having an open mind. I know that's very broad, but It's a very good question. I'll have to think about it some more. Conflicting ideas, it happens all the time. There's always, we live in a society of, in fact, of quite severe polarization. So what does art do? Art can be a space, like a neutral space for people to think about the issues more deeply. So instead of going with their gut reaction and attacking another position or feeling super defensive, can art be a way to bring conciliation, to bring needed alternative perspectives to an issue? So that's what I think what art can do is just bring other points of view and hopefully lead towards either a resolution or at least a full recognition of what we're facing, as opposed to a sort of diametrical, more simplistic approach to a complex issue. But it's a good question. I think it's not an easy question to answer because there's no magic solutions here. Art has played a really important role in conflict resolution, but there are also just straight ahead conflict resolution techniques that work really well as well. Art doesn't solve all issues, but it certainly can help, and especially some of the more delicate ones. It can be extremely impactful.
I agree. I think that's a very good response to that question. I think that art can bring us together, so it could be viewed within the sphere of activism as that connector. So I would have a very similar response.
Good.
Any other questions? Yes, Micah?
Sorry to be taking up a lot of time.
No, it's fine. I'm happy.
I know that in this class specifically, and sort of a broader initiative within the program, is to really shed light on issues around equity and inclusion and diversity. And I was just wondering, in your experience, do you find that there's an example of a community that isn't receiving enough attention or sort of isn't being allowed enough of the spotlight? And do you think that there's maybe topics that should be talked about but haven't been given the time?
Well, it's a good question. The Arts Council structure, especially now at Canada Council, is very sensitive to underrepresented voices. And one of the ways, and I can't speak on behalf of the council anymore, but I can talk about my experience there. In my 20 years there were always 4 groups that were underrepresented, and they're not the only ones, but those were the sort of official ones. And one of them was official languages. So if you're working in French, say outside of Quebec, it can be difficult, and vice versa if you're working in English in a majority. So it's sort of a majority-minority thing of official languages. Cultural diversity, so issues of racism have been and continue to be an issue. There's some of the barriers have been addressed, but there's many others and new ones coming through. So and the council does a lot of great work through representation and criteria and many tools that it's developed. Indigenous arts is in a category of its own, of course. The council created a separate program called Creating, Knowing, Sharing in 2016 that has addressed many of the issues, because now Indigenous art is assessed by Indigenous artists in criteria that's specifically made for those practices, arts and culture. And the last one is deaf and disability arts. And those are really important because there are real systematic, and most of these issues have systematic, I have trouble pronouncing that word, systematic issues. And a systematic issue is one that is ingrained. And so you can't just sort of piecemeal it. You have to look at the system as a whole and over time change it. So those are the 4 areas, but there are many others. There's so many other areas that are where our artists don't feel quite understood. And that's ongoing dialogue with the funder and with the institutions. It's not just the funder. Institutions that present sometimes don't understand an art practice. They'll say, oh, that's not for us, or that's not for our audience. But I think curators play a really important role. Educators play a role. The role that Robin Sokoloski and Mass Culture play in sharing knowledge and mobilizing knowledge plays a really important role. So I think that the gaps always need to be front of mind. Who's being left out and why, and what can we do about it? Because we don't want to leave anybody behind. All the voices are important, And as Canada goes through decolonization, I think there's some really interesting new ways of working will emerge, are emerging, and will emerge, and it will be a different world, and for the better. In spite of the environmental degradation, humans will figure out how to coexist with other living beings, and art itself will change.
Excellent. All right. I think we will leave it there.
Okay.
And go to our 10-minute break, everyone. Thank you so much, Claude. This has been very refreshing, great, I think, format to set this up in. I appreciate all of your questions, everyone. So thank you so much for engaging with us. And yes, if any of you are interested in scale, perhaps, Claude, you can leave the website link in the chat, in the Zoom chat, if anyone's interested in art and climate. And
yeah, you can join. There's an email list now. You can join to get information. There will be a big assembly in the spring of 2022 that you can join. But if you're interested, you can contact me or any of the other coordinating circle members. And I want to thank you. Is it okay for all of those who have spoken to be in the podcast? I assume yes, you're good to go. Thank you for that. The podcast, and you can listen back to it. And as I go through, I'm always happy to have feedback. So if you have ideas or feedback, I really appreciate that as we go forward. So thank you. I'm going to sign off, and I'll put that link in the chat, and then I'll go on with my day. And congratulations, Janis and Robin, for this class. It's really wonderful to see a class about policy, activism, equity. Those are such important topics. So have fun together, and we'll see you down the road.
Thank you, Claude.